I want to start with a sound. Not music exactly, just the idea of sound. What it might have been like to stand in a trench in northern France before dawn on the last night of June 1916. The artillery had been going for at least a week, at least 7 days of British guns, 1.5 million shells thrown at the German lines. The whole horizon had flickered like a summer storm that wouldn't break. The ground shook under your boots. The noise was so constant it had stopped being noise and had become something more like weather, something you stopped hearing and started breathing in. The men in the trenches had been told this was a good thing. The bombardment would cut the German wire. It would destroy the German dugouts. It would shatter the defenders so completely that when the infantry finally went forward, it would be, and this phrase was actually used by actual British commanders in actual orders, a walk in the park. They were wrong about that. Catastrophically wrong, in ways that would define the rest of the war. On the morning of the 1st of July, 1916, 110 years ago, at approximately 7:30, whistles blew along roughly 25 kilometers of front. Nearly 120,000 men climbed out of their trenches and began to walk across open ground toward German positions. They were met by the guns. The German defenders, sheltering in deep concrete and timber dugouts that the British bombardment hadn't touched, some of them 6, 8, 10 meters underground, emerged as the British barrage lifted, manned their machine guns, and opened fire. Much of the wire in front of the German lines had not been cut. Men piled up in it. Machine guns covered the gaps. The creeping barrage moved too fast for the infantry to keep up. By the end of that single day, the British Army had suffered more than 57,000 casualties. Over 19,000 were dead. It remains the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. And somewhere in the middle of that catastrophe, at a village called Beaumont-Hamel on the northern end of the attack front, one of the most complete destructions of a single unit in the entire war unfolded in the space of about 30 minutes. The unit, of course, was the First Battalion of the Newfoundland Regiment, part of the British 29th Division. They were ordered forward from a reserve trench at approximately 9:05 in the morning, after the first two waves had already been destroyed. From roughly 790 men, give or take, 710 became casualties by the time the smoke cleared. Every officer who went into that battle was a casualty. 14 killed, 12 wounded. When the roll was called the next morning, 68 men answered their names. 68 in about half an hour. In that regiment, on that field, were two brothers from a railway town on the Gander River in the interior of Newfoundland. Harry and Alfred Hynes. This is their story. Welcome to the 32nd episode of the podcast Memory and Valor, where we resurrect the lives and sacrifices of Canadian veterans and soldiers of the First World War. I'm your host, Samantha McRae. Thanks once again for joining me at the crossroads where memory and valor meet. This particular episode is quite a special one. To start with, it is in commemoration of the 110th anniversary of the opening day of the Battle of the Somme, which was the 1st of July, 1916. And it's a pretty poignant battle, and listening, you'll hear why pretty quickly if you're not familiar with it. The other reason this episode is kind of important to me is I want to dedicate it to my family out in Ottawa, my McRae family. This is a story that affects them and affected them directly, whether they realize it or not. My cousins, Terry and late Wendy, were the grandchildren of a First World War veteran. His name was Alfred Hynes. This episode serves to remember and honor not just Alfred, but his brother Harry as well. And so, my family out in Ottawa, this one's for you. Let's get on with the show.
Well, the government of Newfoundland issued a proclamation asking all people who were qualified and of the appropriate age to enlist. The country needed them. Newfoundland was Britain's oldest colony. We were loyal in our support to the Great Britain, to the Empire. And as a Newfoundlander, I guess we all felt that we should get involved.
Before we get into the field, I want to spend some time in Newfoundland because to understand what happened at Beaumont-Hamel on July 1st, 1916, what it really meant, what it really cost, one has to understand the place that paid the price. In 1914, Newfoundland was not part of Canada, and I'll say that again because it's so important. They were not part of Canada. It was its own British dominion, its own government, its own legislature, its own distinct identity shaped by centuries of fishing and sealing and the particular isolation of island life on the edge of the North Atlantic. In 1914, the population of Newfoundland was approximately 240,000 people, and that's smaller than the city of St. Albert in Alberta today. And from that population of 240,000, more than 12,000 Newfoundlanders would enlist in the First World War. 1 in every 20 people on the island, if you count men, women, and children, the elderly, went to war. Think about what that means in a community. In a small town where everyone knows everyone, where the postmistress knows which family is waiting for a telegram, where the minister knows which houses will be getting bad news. In Glenwood, on the Gander River, when 2 brothers from the same family put on the same uniform and crossed the same ocean, everybody in town knew about it. When Britain declared war on Germany in August 1914, Newfoundland was automatically at war, as were Canada and all other dominions of the British Empire, and the response was remarkable. The governor committed Newfoundland to raising a regiment of 500 men within a month. The first recruitment office opened, and within a week, 275 men had signed up. They trained at Pleasantville on the outskirts of St. John's. There wasn't enough khaki fabric on the island for the leg wrappings. They're called the puttees. So they were made from navy blue material. The blue puttees. The name became legend. The first 537 men actually, but history rounds numbers, sailed from St. John's on the 4th of October 1914. 25,000 people lined the streets to watch them go. In a city of perhaps 30,000, that was nearly everyone. They told the men they'd be home by Christmas, and they were not home by Christmas. They trained in England. They went to Gallipoli in 1915, fought on the slopes above Suvla Bay, and some of them died there. And they came back sick and shaken. They recovered in Egypt. And in March 1916, the regiment came to France, to the Somme, to the 29th Division, to the trenches in the front of a French village that almost no one in Newfoundland had ever heard of, Beaumont-Hamel. And the regiment kept needing men. The war was consuming them. Gallipoli and the trench operations since had taken their toll, so Newfoundland kept sending more. Steady streams of reinforcements crossing the Atlantic to keep the regiment alive. Alfred Hynes had been part of one such stream, and Harry Hynes had been part of another. By mid-April of 1916, both of them were in the line. I want to pause for a moment and just remind you guys, if you've been listening to the podcast for a little while now, you'll know that I did an episode on the Newfoundland Regiment and its role at Beaumont-Hamel on the 1st of July, 1916. I did that episode probably about 3 months ago, and I got to tell you, it's probably the most popular episode that I've done so far. So I know I may be overlapping a little bit here and repeating myself. However, the 110th anniversary of this date of that morning is fast approaching. And again, like I said, I know I may be overlapping information. However, this particular episode is going to focus on these brothers And so that's why you're getting a little bit of redundant information. Just stay with me here. Glenwood sits on the Gander River in the interior of Newfoundland. Like I said, it's a railway town on the line the Reed Company ran across the island from St. John's to Port aux Basques. It was a working community of timber operations and rail yards and telegraph stations. It was where the rhythm of life was set by the trains and the seasons and the river. This was home to Esau Hynes and his wife, Mary Elizabeth. Mary Elizabeth Lacey she had been before she married. Her family was from Twillingate on the north coast, a fishing town that jutted out into Notre Dame Bay. She'd come inland and married Esau and raised her children in Glenwood. They had sons, and if memory serves, I believe they had 5 sons. 2 of them went to war. Now, the elder was Harry, Private Harry Raymond Hynes. His regimental number was 1621. Harry is, to be direct with you, the more elusive of the 2 brothers in the historical record. The documents that we have are the baseline. There's an attestation paper, a service record, a casualty form, and a Commonwealth War Graves Commission entry. A conduct sheet that contains, before the 1st of July, exactly nothing remarkable. He was a soldier doing his job. He kept his head down and didn't run up debts or pick fights or go absent without leave. He just served. Harry enlisted at St. John's on 26th of June, 1915, and sailed on 27th of October. He trained in England through the fall and winter of 1915, crossed to France in late March 1916, landing at Rouen. On the 15th of April 1916, he joined the First Battalion in the field. He had been in France for less than 3 months when the 1st of July came. The younger son carried his mother's maiden name as his own, Alfred Lacey Hynes, regimental number 1463. Alfred is more present in the records, not because he was more remarkable, but because he survived, and survival generates paperwork. The discharge process, the pension applications, the medical follow-ups, they all leave a trail. We know from his attestation paper what Alfred looked like. 5'10", dark hair, blue eyes, with a small scar on his right first finger that some careful recruiting officer wrote down in the description column. He was a telegraph operator by trade. That detail is important. Telegraph operators were skilled men, trained to handle information precisely, to work under pressure, to get the signal through cleanly, even when conditions were bad. The Army had good use for men who could do that. Alfred would eventually end up attached to the Army Signal School. The job found the man. Alfred enlisted a little earlier than Harry at St. John's on the 23rd of April 1915, which is why his regimental number is about 200 men ahead of Harry's. He sailed in June 1915 on the steamship Calgarian. He went to Egypt with the regiment, and in early April 1916, the regiment came up from the Mediterranean to France, landing at Marseille, and traveling north by train to the Somme. So here is something the service records reveal that the family at home could not have known at the time. In the spring of 1916, both brothers were converging on the same battalion from completely opposite directions. This is just a really interesting little piece of information. Alfred had come up from Egypt through Marseille. Harry had come across from England through Rouen. They arrived at the 1st Battalion within about 2 weeks of each other in mid-April 1916, and they ended up in the same company, F Company, 1st Battalion, Newfoundland Regiment, from opposite ends of the war back to the same regiment. Brothers. Both of them signed over 50 cents a day from their pay, sent home to their mother through the Bank of Montreal. So every payday, money crossed the ocean to Mary Elizabeth Hynes in Glenwood. The records tell us something that makes this almost unbearable to hold. That Harry and Alfred were both in F Company, the same company. This meant that they went forward together on the morning of the 1st of July 1916, side by side, most likely, from the same trench. One of them was carried off the field. One of them was never seen again. James R. Steele was a second lieutenant with the 2nd Contingent of the Newfoundland Regiment on that day. And in 1966, he gave an interview to CBC on the 50th anniversary of the first day of the Battle of the Somme.
When did you leave to go to the front?
The 30th of March. 30th of June.
30th of June. Do you recall arriving at the Beaumont-Hamel area?
That's right. Arrived there about early in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning. And we had some rations then, ready to go off the first thing in the morning.
When did you actually reach the trenches? Do you recall?
About 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning.
Did the men, or did you recall having any knowledge of the battle or what was going to take place at that time?
We knew we had to take Beaumont-Hamel there, but we were told it'd be an easy job.
The understatement of the year.
That's right.
Now, I understand you weren't the only people involved in this battle. Besides the Newfoundland Regiment, there were others.
The 29th Division. And two of their regiments went up ahead of us, and we were the third to go over the top. And when we were all wiped out, and the fourth one was stopped, didn't go.
What was the day like that early morning? What was the weather like that first morning?
A very fine, very hot day, very sunny.
Did you have much equipment?
Oh, with all we can carry.
What was the plan of battle? Was there troubles getting out of the trenches through the barbed wire?
No trouble out of the barbed wires out in front. We just had to walk out to that and go through cut passageways and then line up in front and continue on. But we didn't get very far.
Now, how far would you say was it from your trenches to the German trenches?
Well, I should say somewhere about 200 yards. And a few of us got over about halfway over before being knocked out.
Before you actually left the trenches, was there any bombardment or anything of this nature?
No, early in the morning, but not afterwards. And we just continued straight on against heavy enemy fire, shells and machine guns.
Could you actually see the enemy?
No, because he was down these trenches.
Now, the other men of other regiments who attacked before you did, could you see what was happening there?
Yeah, oh yes, we could see they'd been wiped out. We thought we wouldn't get much of a chance. We went ahead right behind the other English regiments after they had been wiped out, and we continued on and until every man was wiped out. And there's nothing else to do. There's another regiment supposed to come behind ours, but they didn't let it go afterwards. There's no chance of getting through.
Who were the first ones to leave? Which were the English?
Two English regiments, and we were the third.
Where were they in relation to you? Were they to your left?
A little bit to our left, yes.
This was a continuous line made up of...
Yes, continuous line, yes, made up of 3 or 4 regiments.
Did you or any of the men have time to think about what was going on?
Oh yes, we could see it because the other regiment went ahead of us, and sometimes they ahead of our regiment, and we had to follow behind them. And we saw there's practically no hope, but we tried anyway.
How was the order was given and everybody got up at the same time?
That's right. As soon as we got order to advance, we went.
Would you say that most of the men made it halfway sort of thing, or did they actually come running under fire as soon as they approached the trenches?
They came under fire as soon as they left our trenches, and they start dropping all the way over, and they got less than halfway over.
Can you recall the scene when you yourself got hit?
Yeah, when I was hit in the head and knocked unconscious for a little while, and I came through, and I stayed still then. all day in the very hot sun.
Why did you stay still at that time?
Because looking up, I see chaps running back and being wiped out right away by a machine gun fire. So I stayed and crawled back about 11 o'clock that night.
Now, if we want to really grasp what happened on the 1st of July, we need to kind of sit on that hill for a moment in France. The British 29th Division was one of the most experienced formations in the entire British Army. They were regular troops mostly, seasoned veterans who had been through Gallipoli, like the kind of division you'd put on a difficult task. And the Beaumont-Hamel sector was a very difficult task. The German position here had been fortified for nearly 20 months by the time the attack came. The unit holding it was the 119th Reserve Infantry Regiment from Württemberg. They'd spent that time not just training, but building. Dugouts going 6, 8, sometimes 10 meters underground, shored up with timber and corrugated iron, designed to survive even a direct hit from a heavy shell. There was a network of tunnels and covered approaches, and most importantly, Y Ravine. Now, Y Ravine is a natural feature. It's a deep, jagged gully cutting laterally across the German position, roughly parallel to the British lines. It's perhaps 6 meters deep in places and 30 meters wide. The Germans had turned it into a fortress. They'd dug fighting positions into the ravine walls and built shelters that could hold whole platoons, and created a system of covered movement that let them shift men around under the ground without exposing themselves to British observation. Now here's the geography that made the whole position so dangerous for the attackers. The British lines sat on a ridge. The Germans held the lower ground, the ravine and the slopes below. And I know this sounds counterintuitive. We usually think of high ground as advantageous, but at Beaumont-Hamel, it worked the other way. When the British and Newfoundland troops stood up and left their trenches, they were silhouetted against the sky. The Germans, looking up from the ravine and the valley floor, could see exactly where the British wire had been gapped for the attack. So they knew precisely where the attacking infantry would be funneled. Before the battle started, German machine gunners trained their weapons on those gaps in the wire. They sighted the guns, adjusted the elevation and traverse, and when the men came through the gaps, the guns were already aimed. The British tried to shift the odds with a mine, a massive explosive charge. Approximately 18,000 kilograms of charge had been placed in a tunnel under the German strongpoint at Hawthorne Ridge Redoubt. On the morning of the 1st of July, 10 minutes before the infantry attack, the mine was detonated. The explosion was absolutely enormous, and it's one of the most famous images of the entire war. You look at the photograph and you can see a column of earth and debris rising into the summer morning sky. And it was filmed by a British camera crew, so you can actually see the video of this. The problem was exactly that 10-minute gap, though. 10 minutes warning for the German defenders near the blast to get clear, to man their positions, and to be ready. The British infantry assault went forward at 7:30 a.m., and the Germans were waiting. The first wave of the 29th Division's assault was stopped almost immediately. So was the second wave. The communication trenches were jammed with casualties, people, dead and wounded men, blocking the approaches, and reports coming back to divisional headquarters were fragmentary, confused, and even contradictory. And in that confusion, a decision was made. Reports suggested, incorrectly based on misread signal rockets, that some troops from the first wave had broken through. General Delisle believed he had a breakthrough developing, and so he ordered the 88th Brigade forward to exploit it. The Newfoundland Regiment on the left of the brigade's 2-battalion advance was ordered to attack. Now, because the communication trenches were blocked, they went from their reserve position, not from the front trench, but from a support trench roughly 200 yards behind it, which meant They had to cross the British front line, cross no man's land, and fight through whatever remained beyond. There was almost no artillery available to support them, flanks or otherwise. The men of the First Battalion of the Newfoundland Regiment went forward into open ground with machine guns already traversing, with barbed wire still standing, and with the German defenders fully alert and fully manned. As Tim Cook has written of the men of the Canadian Corps, in these same weeks of 1916, the soldiers of the Great War faced an industrial killing system for which no amount of courage, and these men had no shortage of courage, was a sufficient answer. This wasn't a test of bravery. It was men moving into a mechanical landscape that had been calibrated over 2 years of war to destroy exactly this kind of assault. And the regiment was destroyed in about 30 minutes. 14 sets of brothers died that morning with the Newfoundland Regiment. 14 families, each of them receiving 2 notifications instead of 1. 14 pairs of names inscribed together in bronze. Harry and Alfred Hynes were nearly 2 of those pairs.
I had a brother shot right through the chest. I went over and went in the same company that he was in. That's in B Company.
So the Newfoundland Regiment had been in the Beaumont-Hamel sector since early April. That's nearly 3 months of living in and around those trenches, learning the ground, learning the German positions, and learning the particular sounds of that section of front. By the 1st of July, these men knew this piece of earth better than they'd known almost anywhere. Trench life on the Western Front had developed its own rhythms. The morning and the evening stand to, when every man stood at the parapet with his rifle ready in case of dawn or dusk attack. The working parties at night, moving supplies and ammunition under cover of darkness. The steady trickle of casualties from snipers and random shell fire that the men had simply accepted as part of the landscape. And through it all, for the roughly 7 days before the 1st of July, the British guns fired without stopping. Again, 1.5 million shells. The men in the trenches could feel it in their bodies. There must have been a constant vibration, a pressure in the chest, and a sound that became the background frequency of existence. And they were told repeatedly and authoritatively that this was working, that the German wire was being cut, that the German positions were being destroyed, that the German defenders would be so shattered by the bombardment that the infantry assault would be almost just a formality. There were raids to test that premise. Before the main assault, the Newfoundlanders had gone out into no man's land twice, testing the German wire. On the night of the 26th of June, 57 men went out. They fired Bangalore torpedoes, tubes of explosives designed to blow gaps in barbed wire. The wire was too thick. The torpedoes didn't clear it. They had to resort to wire cutters. The Germans fired flares, saw them, and drove them back. Headquarters ordered a second raid. On the night of the 27th to 28th of June, 4 days before the battle, another party went out. This time, they found a gap in the German wire, but the intelligence gathered wasn't reassuring. The German positions were intact and the defenders were alert. The wire was not uniformly cut. This information existed. What happened to it between the men who went on those raids and the generals who made the final decisions is a question that military historians have been asking about the first day of the Somme for 100 years. On the night of the 30th of June, the men of the Newfoundland Regiment stood in their trenches and waited for morning. We don't know what Harry and Alfred Hynes said to each other that night or whether they spoke at all. We don't know if they were close enough in the trench system to see each other. We don't know what they were thinking. The record is silent on that. It was always going to be silent. These are not men who kept diaries, who wrote long letters home, who left the kind of documentary evidence that fills the memoirs and archives of the officer class. What we know is that they were both there, both sons of Esau and Mary Elizabeth Hynes from Glenwood on the Gander River, both in the line on the Somme on the night before, both of them presumably waiting for the whistle. For Harry, the record is simple and absolute. His conduct sheet, the Army's running log of a soldier's career, updated through training, through the line, through the day-to-day business of military service, is unremarkable before the 1st of July. He didn't distinguish himself particularly in one direction or the other. He was a soldier who did what was asked of him, who sent money home, and who showed up. There is nothing against his name in the columns for offenses or punishments. The only entry is 3 words and a date. Missing. 1/7/16. That's it. That's the entire record of what happened to Harry Raymond Hynes on the 1st of July, 1916. 3 words in a column of a leisure. Back in Newfoundland, the family waited for news, and news came the way it always came, not by a knock on the door, not by a friendly voice saying there was news and they should sit down, but by telegram. A sheet of paper handed over a counter, cold words in the formal language of the Colonial Secretary's office. On the 31st of July, 1916, exactly 1 month after the battle, a wire reached the Hynes family. It reported Harry as missing. And I have a copy of that telegram from Harry's service record, and I'm going to read it to you exactly as it says. Dated July 31, 1916, to Mr. Esau Hynes, Glenwood. Regret to inform you that the Record Office, London, officially reports number 1621 Private Harry Hynes as missing. Upon receipt of further information, I shall immediately wire you. J.R. Bennett, Colonial Secretary. Missing. Not killed, not wounded, missing. And I want to stay with that word for a minute because I think people who've never had to wait for news from a war don't always appreciate what it meant. Missing wasn't a comfortable word. Missing was not reassuring. Missing was hope that wouldn't let itself collapse into grief. Missing meant he's not confirmed dead, which means he could be a prisoner, which means he could be alive somewhere, in a German hospital, in a camp, somewhere the information just hasn't reached us yet, which means you could not mourn, because mourning felt like you were giving up hope, which means you were suspended between grief and hope, neither able to let go nor able to hold on with any confidence. That word sat in the Hynes household through August 1916, through September, through October. All autumn, the casualty lists in the Newfoundland papers carried the name Hynes, H.R., under the heading Missing. All autumn, Esau and Mary Elizabeth held the possibility open. And then, on the 23rd of November, 1916, nearly 5 months after the 1st of July, the Colonial Secretary of Newfoundland wrote the letter. He was writing it to many families that fall, because none of the men listed as missing from the 1st of July had turned up alive in German captivity. Not one prisoner had been accounted for from Beaumont-Hamel. The conclusion was now inescapable. And I'm going to read to you the letter that Harry Hynes' parents received. And it is dated November 23rd, 1916. Dear Sir, for some time past, the Imperial Government have been making inquiries in relation to those men of the 1st Newfoundland Regiment who have been reported missing since the action of the 1st July. I very much regret to state, however, that from the correspondence which has taken place, a copy of which I enclose, it is evident that none of them are prisoners of war in Germany, and the authorities are, therefore, reluctantly forced to the conclusion that all these gallant men, whose names are given in the enclosed list, and one of whom was very dear to you, were killed in that fateful action on the 1st of July. I desire to express to you on behalf of the government, as well as for myself, the sincerest sympathy in this time of sorrow. We feel the loss of our loved ones, but it will, no doubt, be some consolation to you to think that he, for whom you now mourn, willingly answered the call of king and country, did his part nobly, and fell, facing the foe, in defense of the principles of righteousness, truth, and liberty. Though he has laid down the earthly weapons of warfare, he now wears the soldier's crown of victory, and his name will be inscribed upon the glorious roll of honor, and will be held in fragrant memory by all his fellow countrymen. When the victory is won and peace again reigns upon the earth, it will be a comforting thought to you that in this glorious achievement he bore no small part. I trust that you may have the grace and consolation of the great Father of us all at this time. With sincere sympathy, believe me to be your obedient servant, Colonial Secretary. Harry Raymond Hynes was 21 years old. His body was never recovered. He has no known grave. He is named instead on the Beaumont-Hamel Newfoundland Memorial, the great bronze caribou that stands today on the highest point of the preserved battlefield, overlooking the very ground where the regiment fell. At the base of that caribou, 3 bronze tablets bear the names of more than 800 Newfoundlanders who died in the war and have no known grave, and Harry's name is one of them. The paperwork of Harry's death ran on for years, in the cold administrative language of accounts settled and payments stopped. His personal estate, everything the army held of his, came to £9, 19 shillings and 6 pence. That was $66.54 sent home to his family. The allotment he'd been making, the 50 cents a day for his mum, was stopped in the spring of 1917, and the machinery ground on. In 1921, 5 years after the battle, a package arrived for Esau Hynes at Norris Arm, where the family had by then moved. Inside was the memorial plaque, the bronze medallion that the families of the dead called the dead man's penny. It bore Harry's name in raised bronze letters. With it came the memorial scroll, printed with the king's message of condolence, formal words printed in their thousands, sent to the families of the dead, and Harry's 2 service medals. Esau Hynes signed the receipt for his dead son's medals with a mark, an X. He could not write his own name. I find I keep coming back to that X. The father who couldn't read or write, pressing his mark to a government form to acknowledge receipt of the medals that came back in place of his son. The weight of grief contained in that single mark, the distance between the bureaucratic language of a form, all its columns and reference numbers, and the human reality of what had happened. I don't see that X as a failure. It's not a sign of ignorance. It's a man of his time and place and circumstances doing what the form required, but it sits on the page like a wound. I want to break away from the service records for a moment and think about Harry as a person, because it's one of the peculiar cruelties of this kind of history that the men who died are often the most invisible, the ones whose paper trail ends abruptly in 1916 and leaves us with almost nothing to go on. Harry Raymond Hynes was 21 years old when he died. He had been born in 1895 into a Newfoundland that was still Victorian in character, a world of telegraph lines and cod schooners and church halls of winter cold that sat in the interior of the island like something alive, of train whistles and river sounds, and the small social universe of a railway town. He grew up in Glenwood. He would have known every family on the street. He would have known the Gander River in all its moods, the spring floods, the summer fishing, and the way the ice took hold in November. He would have had cousins and schoolmates and the whole web of small-town relationships. He probably had people he liked and people he couldn't stand and people he was sweet on and people whose names aren't in any archive anywhere. He signed over half his pay to his mother every payday, 50 cents a day, sent home through the Bank of Montreal. In a 24-hour period of military service, half of everything he earned crossed the Atlantic to Glenwood. This isn't a heroic gesture in the historical sense. It's just a son taking care of his family the way sons did. I tell you this again because later on I'm going to throw you a little bit of a plot twist here. He didn't write memoirs. He didn't leave a collection of letters that we know of. He didn't keep a diary that we know of. And lots of soldiers didn't. Most of them, actually. The ones who left mountains of papers tended to be the officers, the educated, the men who already had a relationship with putting words on a page. Private Harry Hynes was a working man from a railway town whose father couldn't write his own name. So the archive kind of was not built for him. What we have of Harry is a conduct sheet, a casualty form, a Commonwealth War Graves Commission entry, and a name on a memorial in France. But he also had a brother who survived. I want to try something a bit different for a moment, so bear with me. Again, we don't have correspondence and letters from Harry Hynes. We don't have a diary. We don't have the memoir or interview or anything that gives us Harry's voice directly. The archive doesn't hold him that way, but we have the general shape of what soldiers in his position wrote, because thousands of them wrote it, and a lot of those letters and postcards and field service cards have survived. Now, the field service card, it was a pre-printed form with boxes for soldiers to tick. The soldiers used because it was quick and censors didn't fuss over it. It was one of the primary means of communication between the front and home. You could tick a box, I am quite well. You could tick another box, I have received your letter. You could cross out the boxes that didn't apply. Many families kept those cards for the rest of their lives. They kept them because they were the last things their sons had sent. Because the last field service card often arrived after the telegram. Because the last message, ticked and mailed from a trench somewhere in France, arrived in Glenwood or Norris Arm or Twillingate after the word had already come that the man who'd sent it was gone. I don't know if Harry Hynes sent field service cards. I don't know if he wrote letters home or if any survived or if the family kept them. What I know is that the form of communication existed and that tens of thousands of families across the British Empire sat in the same position as the Hynes family in the summer of 1916, waiting for news, reading the lists in the newspapers, holding the hope and the dread in the same moment. And I know that Mary Elizabeth Hynes from Twillingate waited. She waited through July and August and September and October and November 1916. She waited through the autumn and the long Newfoundland winter. She waited through all the years that followed for Harry to somehow come back or be found or be explained. The way grief doesn't fully close even when the mind has to accept the fact. She waited 33 years, and then she died on the 2nd of July, 1949, the day after.
After the battle, I was made burial officer. The Newfoundland Regiment, all volunteers, had come to France and taken part in the Battle of the Somme on the 1st of July, which, as everybody knows, was a complete failure. The Newfoundlanders had been chosen to attack Beaumont-Hamel, which was a fortress with this deep ravine and the deep dugouts. And the Newfoundland Regiment, I think, were decimated. They lost 80% of their battalion. And they had lain out there since the 1st of July, 4.5 months, and I had the job with my burial parties of burying these dead, who of course were skeletons practically, but in uniform, and the shape of the leg was quite round with a putty until one stepped on it, the flesh then having gone, and a rat's nest was in the cage of each chest, and the rats ran out as we shoveled them into shell holes, because what we did, we took the pay books off them, but left their identity discs on, so they could be identified later and given a decent burial. The pay books we put into sandbags, and in the pay book, of course, you had the soldier's will and pictures of his father and mother, or sweetheart, and so on and so forth. Well, we carefully put these into sandbags and shoveled the corpses into shell holes and covered them up as well as we could, and we tried where we could to get a bit of wood and just make some mark on it. to identify the place, but the shell holes were overlapping. So they would have to dig the lot up to give them a decent burial. In any case, the Newfoundlanders had suffered there probably more than any other regiment.
Alfred was the brother carried off the field. We know this not because the regiment's war diary tracks individual movements at that level of detail. It doesn't. But because of what happened to Alfred afterward. The medical files tell the story backwards. A wound serious enough to require evacuation to England, serious enough to keep him out of the line for 3 months. Gunshot and shrapnel to the back and the right arm. And a metal fragment of shrapnel that drove inward, penetrated the abdominal wall, and came to rest somewhere near one of his kidneys. The surgeons at the Duchess of Connaught Canadian Red Cross Hospital at Taplow, a commandeered country house on the Thames, turned like so many comfortable Edwardian buildings into a place for putting broken men back together. They looked for it. The medical report says, in the flat clinical language of Army Form B.179A, penetrated abdominal wall, not found. Alfred would carry that piece of shrapnel inside him for the rest of his life. He arrived at Taplow on or around the 6th of July, so 5 days after the battle. And that same fortnight, Esau Hynes received 2 separate communications from the Colonial Secretary's office in St. John's. One told him one son was wounded, one told him one son was missing. And I'm going to read you what that telegram to Alfred's father said, verbatim right now. I have it before me here. Dated July 14, 1916, to Mr. Esau G. Hynes, Glenwood. Regret to inform you, number 1463, Private Alfred L. Hynes, was at Duchess Connaught's Canadian Hospital, Taplow, England, July 6th, wounded. J.R. Bennett, Colonial Secretary. It doesn't even tell his father what type of wounds he had, only that he was. Alfred spent the better part of 3 months at Taplow recovering, and then he did something that I find genuinely hard to process even after spending a great deal of time with this history. He went back. He returned to the First Battalion of the Newfoundland Regiment, voluntarily. Knowing what had happened on the 1st of July, he was there. Knowing what had happened to his brother Harry. Carrying a piece of German shrapnel that the surgeons hadn't been able to find, he went back to France. After Beaumont-Hamel, the regiment had been taken out of the line, rebuilt, because they were decimated. They were reinforced with new drafts from the island, so by October 1916, it was fighting again in a later phase of the Somme, with better results, but still significant losses. Then winter, then Arras. At Monchy-le-Preux, on the 14th of April 1917, the Newfoundland Regiment was ordered to attack positions east of the village. The Germans had, by this point, adopted a new defensive system, what the military historians call an elastic or a defense-in-depth approach. And this is where the front line would deliberately give way under pressure, and powerful counterattack formations waiting in the rear would strike the attackers when they were extended and vulnerable. The Newfoundlanders advanced into exactly that situation. They were surrounded. Of approximately 611 officers and other ranks who went into battle, 487 became casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. Alfred Hynes was one of the wounded. This time, gunshot wound to the left leg. He was evacuated, treated, recovered. He went back again. G.W.L. Nicholson, in his authoritative history of the Newfoundland Regiment, describes this pattern of return and sacrifice as fundamental to the regiment's character. Men who understood what they were going back to and went anyway, drawn by loyalty to the regiment, to their comrades, to the island that had sent them. Alfred Hynes went back 3 times. On the 30th of November, 1917, at Cambrai, he was wounded for the 3rd time. gunshot wounds to the left thigh, the left leg, and a finger. Cambrai was the great experiment, the first major use of massed tanks in a British offensive. The plan was for hundreds of tanks to roll over the Hindenburg Line, crushing the barbed wire and crossing the trenches while the infantry followed behind. The Newfoundland Regiment, as part of the 29th, crossed the canal and pushed towards the town of Marcoing. And it was for Cambrai, combined with the regiment's performance throughout 1917, including the grinding hell of Passchendaele, that King George V awarded the regiment the royal prefix. The regiment became the Royal Newfoundland Regiment on the 28th of September, 1917. No other regiment in the entire British Army received the royal designation during active fighting in the First World War. Not one. The Newfoundland Regiment was the only one. Alfred Hynes was bleeding for the name as it was being earned. By the time the armistice came in November 1918, Alfred had risen from private to corporal. He'd spent time attached to the Army Signal School, fitting for a telegraph operator. He was discharged on the 13th of April, 1919. 3 years and nearly 11 months of service. A 20% disability on his discharge papers. And somewhere in his body still was the piece of shrapnel from the 1st of July, 1916. It was never removed. He went home to Newfoundland. And I want to think for a moment about what it meant to come home. Tim Cook, our great late historian, examining the experiences of veterans returning from the First World War, notes that they came back to a world that had almost no framework for receiving them. There were no meaningful psychological services. There was no language, really, for what they'd experienced. The term shell shock existed, but the understanding behind it was crude and often punitive. Men were expected in most cases to just get back to life, go back to work, stop dwelling. Alfred Hynes went back to Glenwood. He carried that shrapnel in his body. He carried the memories. Beaumont-Hamel, the field, his brother going forward, the hospital at Taplow, Monchy-le-Preux in the April dark, Cambrai in November, and the knowledge that Harry was still somewhere in the soil of France, unrecovered, unknown on the ground even as his name was written in bronze above it. He carried a 20% disability pension, which the government would argue about for years, the way governments always argued about these things. He carried the particular silence of the veteran who has seen something the people around him cannot comprehend and has decided that it's easier not to try to explain. And he built a life. That's the remarkable thing. It's the ordinary thing, but it's the thing that gets overlooked in the military histories, which tend to end when the war ends. Alfred Hynes came home and built a life. He had a son. He had a daughter. Her name was Frances Maud Hynes. She would grow up knowing that her father had survived a war that had taken so many others, including her Uncle Harry, who she never got to know, who was somewhere in France with no grave to visit. She would have grown up with the specific knowledge that children of veterans carry, even when the explicit conversations don't happen, that her father had been somewhere terrible, that he'd come back changed, that he'd carried something he didn't always talk about. There's a version of Alfred's story that ends cleanly with his discharge in April 1919 and his return to Newfoundland. And in the official record, it does end there. The service file closes, the pension's established, the Army's claim on Alfred Lacey Hynes is concluded. But the actual story doesn't end in 1919. It just becomes invisible to the archive. Alfred carried the shrapnel from Beaumont-Hamel in his body for the rest of his life, and this is a literal fact with a literal daily reality. Pain, or the awareness of foreign metal in your abdomen, or both. The surgeons looked, they couldn't find it, and eventually declared him fit to return to duty. The piece of shrapnel became part of him. He also carried what he'd seen, and there was no mechanism in 1919 for processing any of it. No debrief, no counseling. The language for what we now call post-traumatic stress didn't exist in any useful clinical sense. Again, men were expected to return to civilian life and get on with it. And Alfred got on with it. And in Norris Arm, in 1921, Esau Hynes received the package, the plaque, the scroll, the medals. He signed for them with an X. And Mary Elizabeth, their mother, the Lacey girl from Twillingate who had raised these boys and watched them go to war one after the other in the summer of 1915. She lived a long time with Harry's absence. Born in 1871, she outlived her son by 33 years. And she died on the 2nd of July, 1949, one day after the anniversary of her son's death. I've sat with that fact for a while, trying to decide what to make of it, whether it's pure coincidence or whether something in her body simply knew. Whether a body can carry grief long enough that it becomes part of the calendar, I don't know. What I know is that she lived with those 33 years after the 1st of July with whatever form of continuing loss that was, and then she was gone. I want to step back from the Hynes family just for a minute and think about the shape of what Beaumont-Hamel meant to Newfoundland as a whole, because the scale of the loss was not just a military fact, it was a social catastrophe that reshaped the province in ways that are still present today. So 14 sets of brothers died within the Newfoundland Regiment on that first day of July 1916. So 14 families who received not one notification but two, and the names on the Caribou Memorial represent something specific to small island life. A regiment was not an abstract entity. In a province of 240,000 people, everyone who was in the regiment came from somewhere that everyone else knew. The regiment was the island's regiment, full of men whose families knew each other's families, whose home communities were interconnected, and everybody knew who everybody was. So when the casualty list came in the days and the weeks following, in telegrams and newspaper columns, they fell on a population that was reading the names of people it knew, not abstractions. Neighbors, cousins, the boy from the next bay, the clerk from the hardware store, the fisherman's son. Tim Cook, again writing about the Canadian Corps and the Somme, describes the casualty list as arriving in communities like repeated blows, each one landing before the previous shock had faded. For Newfoundland, the 1st of July was not one blow among many. It was a single catastrophic morning that removed in half an hour a generation's worth of young men from a province that could not easily absorb the loss. Alfred Hynes was one of the men who went back. He went back and went back again and went back a third time. His choice to return, made in the face of everything he knew and experienced, is one of the small human facts that sits inside the larger history. The stats often don't capture it. The casualty returns don't capture it. The man who came back from hospital and got back on the boat 3 times is doing something that requires acknowledgement, even if it resists full explanation. Whatever it was, loyalty to his comrades, obligations to the regiment, a sense that the job wasn't finished, the particular tenacity of island people who don't quit. It was real, and it deserves to be named. There's a thing that happens with the big casualty numbers from the First World War. They stop working. 57,000 casualties on the first day of the Somme, more than 19,000 dead in a single day, 710 men from the Newfoundland Battalion in 30 minutes. These are numbers so large that the human brain refuses to hold them. They become abstract, data points in a historical argument, evidence in a debate about generalship or strategy or the madness of war. They lose their weight. Harry Hynes is not a data point. He's a 21-year-old man from Glenwood who sent 50 cents a day home to his mom and whose dad couldn't write his name. He's named in bronze on the memorial in France. He is somewhere in the soil near Beaumont-Hamel, unrecovered, unknown on the ground, even as his name is inscribed above it. And Alfred, the telegraph operator who was shot 3 times in 2.5 years and who walked back into the line after each wound, who came home to a place still not yet part of Canada in 1919. Newfoundland wouldn't join Confederation till 1949. That honored what he'd given without having any adequate mechanism to help him live with having given it. The Beaumont-Hamel Newfoundland Memorial is actually something very rare in the world. It's a preserved First World War battlefield, preserved. The trenches are still there. The parapet lines, the fire steps, the rusted wire, all maintained in a state that approximates what they looked like in 1916. So when you stand in what was the Newfoundland Regiment support trench on the morning of the 1st of July, you can look out over the ground they crossed. You can see the distance. You can see, if you know where to look, why ravine in the middle ground, and understand immediately, viscerally, in a way that no map or diagram quite captures, what the men were walking into. Every year on the 1st of July, ceremonies are held there. People come from Newfoundland and Labrador, from across Canada, from Britain, from France. They lay wreaths, a bugler plays, names are read, and Harry's name is among them. In Newfoundland and Labrador, the 1st of July carries a weight the rest of Canada doesn't quite feel. It is Canada Day, yes, the celebration of Confederation, the red and white flags and the fireworks. But it's also Memorial Day, and the memorial observances come first. Every July in Newfoundland and Labrador begins with mourning before the celebration can start, and the sequencing matters. You don't get to the celebration without going through the grief first. You don't get to the flag waving without standing at the memorial. The Hynes family is part of that reason why. Okay, I want to shift gears here because I want to say something about the kind of war this was, because I think it's important for making sense of what happened to Harry and Alfred and everyone else who was on that field. The First World War is sometimes framed as a war of incompetent generals and wasted lives, kind of a narrative of futility, of lions led by donkeys, of men sent needlessly to their deaths by commanders who don't know what they're doing or didn't care. There's a version of the Beaumont-Hamel story that fits neatly into that frame. Faulty intelligence, incorrect assumptions, misread signal rockets, an order given at the wrong moment, and 710 men become casualties. But the fuller truth is more complicated and, in some ways, more disturbing. The British commanders at the Somme were not, for the most part, idiots. They were intelligent men facing a genuinely unprecedented problem: how to break a defensive system of a kind that had never existed before. The trench warfare of the Western Front had evolved over 2 years into something for which there was no historical precedence. There was no established doctrine, no clear solution. The technology for attack, artillery, infantry, wire cutting, communication, had not kept pace with the technology for defense, which was machine guns, deep dugouts, barbed wire, interlocking fields of fire. The defensive had a decisive structural advantage over the offensive that commanders on both sides spent 4 years trying to find a way around. So the week-long bombardment before the 1st of July was not a stupid idea. In theory, a bombardment of that scale and duration should have done what it was supposed to do. The problem was the gap between theory and the actual conditions. The high proportion of defective shells, the guns too thinly spread across too wide a front, the German dugouts deeper and stronger than British intelligence had appreciated. The gap between what the commanders believed the bombardment had accomplished and what it had actually accomplished was lethal. And the men who paid for that gap were the ones who went over the top. At Beaumont-Hamel specifically, the geography was working against the attackers in ways the preliminary bombardment couldn't fix. So it was the deep ravine, the reverse slope, the wire, the 119th Reserve Regiment that had been fortifying this position for nearly 2 years and knew every inch of ground, the mine that went off too early, the misread signal rockets. Mistakes were made, judgments were wrong, men died who might not have died if different decisions had been made. That's true. But it's also true that the commanders making those decisions were operating under conditions of almost complete informational uncertainty, with communication technologies, so telephones, heliograph, and a runner, that were hopelessly inadequate to the pace and chaos of a broken battle. The Newfoundland Regiment was sent forward into a situation that had already failed. The decision to send them based on misread signal rockets, on incorrect reports of success, on the fog of a battle already lost was a mistake. But it was a mistake made in the conditions of a war that was, in very fundamental ways, beyond the capacity of the men fighting it to control. This does not make the loss smaller. Harry is still dead. Alfred still carried that shrapnel. and 68 men still answered the next roll call. But it changes what we're mourning a little bit. We're not just mourning the consequences of stupidity. We're mourning the consequences of a world that had built killing machines faster than it had built the wisdom to use them. That the industrialized warfare before it had developed any adequate way to survive what industrialized warfare produced. The men of the Newfoundland Regiment, in my opinion, walked into that gap. I told you that this story was not a distant one for me and that it had a bit of a plot twist. And here is what I mean by that. As I said, Alfred Hynes had a daughter, and her name was Frances Maud Hynes. She grew up in Newfoundland, knowing that her father had survived a war that had taken Uncle Harry, that had taken so many others, and she grew up knowing the shape of family absence, the way a missing person becomes part of the structure of a household, present through their absence, never quite gone. Frances Maud Hynes married a man named William F.A. McCrae, my grandma's brother, which made her my great-aunt, my Auntie Francie, a woman I knew and a presence in my family. She married my Uncle Archie. And they were a very prominent couple in my life, which means the man in this story, the one who survived Beaumont-Hamel and Monchy and Cambrai, who was wounded 3 times and came home, who carried that shrapnel for the rest of his days, who went back and back and back and somehow made it, was my Auntie Francie's father. He was family. And I knew him. When I was very small, he was still there. He would come to my Auntie Francie's and Uncle Archie's house in Ottawa, and we would have Christmas dinners together. And I remember him as a small child. He seemed to be 250 years old to me when I was a little girl. I remember him being tall and slim and quiet. And I remember him just being there. Uncle Alfred Hynes died in 1983, an old man at the far end of a long life that the 1st of July 1916 very nearly ended before it had properly begun. I think about that a lot when I work on episodes like this one, the difference between history and memory. The way a war that ended more than 100 years ago is still present. It's still sitting at the kitchen table if you know where to look. Alfred Hynes was not a name in an archive to me. He was a person who existed in my world, who had been to Beaumont-Hamel and came back, who had the memories he did not talk about. And Harry, who did not come back, who was still in that French soil, who was named in bronze on a hillside. Harry is my family's lost man. Auntie Francie's uncle, the one whose name is on the caribou, and I didn't even know he existed until I began to research this. That's the thing about the 1st of July in Newfoundland. It's not a history that belongs to someone else. It's not safely distant. Pull any thread in that province, in almost any community, in almost any family, and you will find people standing on that field. Mine is one of them. Let me bring this back at the end to the 2 brothers. Harry Raymond Hynes, private, number 1621, 21 years old on the 1st of July, 1916, from Glenwood on the Gander River, missing in action. No known grave, named on the Beaumont-Hamel Newfoundland Memorial, the great bronze caribou that stands over the field where the regiment fell. Alfred Lacey Hynes, private, later corporal, number 1463, telegraph operator from Glenwood, wounded at Beaumont-Hamel, at Monchy-le-Preux, at Cambrai, carried a piece of German steel inside him for the rest of his life, served 3 years and nearly 11 months, discharged with a 20% disability, went home, built a life, had a daughter named Frances, a son named Austin, died in 1983, grew old. And their father, Esau Hynes, a man who couldn't write his own name, who received 2 telegrams in the same fortnight of the same terrible summer, who waited 5 years for a package to come from overseas, and who marked his name with an X on the receipt for his dead son's medals. And their mother, Mary Elizabeth, who was born a Lacey at Twillingate in 1871, who outlived Harry by 33 years and who died on the 2nd of July, 1949, the day after. These are not famous people, and they're not in the headline stories. They don't have biographies or plaques. There are 4 people from a railway town on the Gander River who were caught in the mechanism of a world at war. But the war was made of people like them, almost entirely. The famous generals and the famous politicians made the decisions, but the war itself, the actual substance of the thing, the weight and the cost and the grief, belonged to people like Harry and Alfred and Esau and Mary Elizabeth Hynes. That's what I want you to carry away from this episode. Not the casualty totals, though they matter and they should. Not the tactical analysis, though that matters too. But the Hynes family in Glenwood, the 50 cents a day, the X on the receipt. When we say we remember, this is what we mean. We mean them. On the 1st of July, remember them both. The one who did not come back and the one who did and carried it. Thank you so much for joining me once again for yet another episode of Memory and Valor, and for spending this hour and a bit with me and listening to the stories, listening to the history, and in particular, listening to the story of family. When it comes to the first day of the Battle of the Somme and it comes to Newfoundland, I think that you'd be hard-pressed to speak to someone from Newfoundland today who isn't aware of the significance of that date and who probably had someone in their family who was there at that time. If you enjoy this podcast and you'd like to kind of help out to create more content, you can visit www.buymeacoffee.com and just type in Memory and Valor, which will bring up my profile, and you can just literally buy me a coffee, and any kind of coffee is great. Your donation goes a long way to help support this show. It helps me to get more gear, get better microphones, get a lot more research done. I can't thank you enough for any kind of support and donation that you can provide. So thank you so much in advance. So until next time, remember to keep history alive, because where memory endures, valor lives on.